Hey guys, how's it going? Read some more of the Christ of the Covenants by O. Palmer Robertson, and I went over the Abraham Covenant of Promise this time. There's quite a bit there, and I didn't get as many notes on some of the other stuff, but it's something that I'll have to look into deeper more and more. But I want to share with you some of the things that I took from it that I've understood a little bit. What he says at the beginning, he talks about how God dictates the terms of his covenant, and then he gives Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 and chapter 17 verse 1 and 2. And so by that he's saying that when God makes the covenant, it's not a contract or an agreement between God and man. It's God saying, this is the way it is. It's God dictates it, and so this. Then we talk about the formal inauguration, which is in Genesis 15, and basically God says that Abraham's going to have an heir that is going to inherit this land, and that's his promise. And O. Palmer Robertson talks about how in these scriptures it talks about cutting a covenant. And I wish the phone would quit zooming in and trying to focus, but I don't think that I can change that. I don't know. Maybe I need to take some kind of autofocus off or something. Sorry about that. Anyway, so he talks about the cutting of a covenant, and that I've kind of understood a little bit, but I don't as much. But he talks about if a man breaks the covenant, they shall be torn as the sacrifice. And so on the sacrifice is cut into pieces, which is symbolic of, I guess, this life and death bond made by the covenant. So it's symbolic of the covenant. The person who breaks the covenant would be cut into pieces, basically. Basically death would be upon them, and so this covenant is like a pledge to the death, or a bond in blood. Either way, I want to describe that. So we read about that covenant in Genesis chapter 15, the inauguration of it, and then he talks about allusions to the inauguration later on in the Old Testament, how they often kind of refer back to it. He mentions Jeremiah 34, chapter 34, verses 17 through 20, when Israel is breaking a covenant, and it also mentions this language of cutting and passing between parts, which goes back to Genesis 15 and the covenant with Abraham. And then he also talks about he says the covenant is enacted by Zedekiah and his people. And then he says that Zedekiah, he thinks, copied from Moses. And that's because there's these comparisons with the Hebrew slaves in Jeremiah chapter 34, verses 8 through 12, and Exodus 21, 1 through 3. He talks about the sprinkling of blood in Exodus 24, 8 is it's relative to the passing through the pieces in Genesis 15. The blood sprinkling represents cleansing, but it also represents death, just like the sacrifice. The curse, and then he talks about how the curse of the covenant, it mentions how, whoever breaks the covenant will die. Basically, they'll be eaten of birds or animals, and you see that all through the Old Testament, and he listed like tons of times, and I didn't want to write those all down, but I'll probably go over those at some point. But there are so many, and he's saying these are all callbacks to Abraham. And even though he thinks that, like in Jeremiah, that they called back to Exodus, but Exodus also was a callback to Abraham, the covenant with Abraham. And then he talks about the New Testament references to the inauguration, and he talks about Hebrews chapter 9 verses 15 through 20, and then he talks about Matthew chapter 26, verse 28, and Luke 22:20, when Jesus says to, drink from this cup. This is the blood of the new covenant, basically, or my blood poured out for it. In Hebrews is when we read about, the death of a testator and such. And so he continues with what I've talked about earlier, how he says there's like a difference between a covenant and a testament, and but they both relate to death. And a lot of people, when people think of testament, they're thinking of a last will and testament, and it doesn't come into effect until after the person dies, and they don't realize maybe how death is related to a covenant. And I think in the King James Bible, it mentions testament here, and it's so kind of like his argument saying, testament's not the right word, or it's not the right idea, and so I don't think that necessarily has to be an issue, even if he's right that, there's these differences between the covenant and the testament, then, testament may have just been thought of differently then than it is now. We just need to understand it in the context that it's supposed to be understood in. And so he says, they're not the same, even though they both relate to death. A covenant is not a last will and testament, and it's not a last will and testament that's being talking of in these verses. And he basically says that God did not die to activate a will. So, that's not what's being talked about here. And then some evidence, too, of why he thinks, it's talking about a covenant and not a testament, is that verse 17 it talks about dead bodies, multiple. And, I didn't write everything down, so I can't remember exactly how it goes. But basically, a last will and testament is like one person dies, but a covenant affects multiple people. So he's saying that that's an argument for that, and then. Verse 16 talks about death being brought forward. And he says that Christ took on himself the curse of the covenant. And that we have to interpret the scriptures, the immediate context. So we have to look at verse 17 with 16. And we also have to look at verse 18. And 18 talks about blood shedding, which is a covenant language, I guess. Making of a covenant must include the symbolic death of the covenant maker. And the symbolic death of the covenant and maker, I guess. This is why it's made strong after death. So yeah, when we read that, a testament, however it says in Hebrews, it's after the death of a testator, basically, it's made strong. And so that gives us this idea of a last will and testament. It doesn't come into effect until after he dies. But that's not exactly what it's saying. And, I think that from what I understand, from what I read, I agree with him. So a lot of what I've seen people interpret, or maybe even I believe myself, is inaccurate as far as that goes. And but he says that the making of a covenant must include the symbolic death of the covenant and maker, and this is why it's made strong after death. And so like I said, I need to look into this stuff more. I can't really explain exactly. I got stuff to go off of here, and then I'm going to have to look into it kind of deeper to explain better. But I guess, like the last will and testament, it's like somebody has to die and then something comes into effect. But with the covenant, there's this promise made, and I guess there's like an obligation to keep this promise or whatever, and then if it's broken, then death will occur. And so there's always this symbolic, when the covenant is made, you know, there's like the sacrifice and stuff that is symbolic of, you know, what will happen. And so when somebody does break the covenant and they die, then it makes the covenant stronger. It makes see, I don't know how to explain it. It's like a realization of the covenant that was like already, you know, inaugurated. It's not like it becomes inaugurated after death, which is what basically people are believing. I think a lot of people. So I hope you can kind of think about that and understand where I'm going at with here. I'm just kind of rushing things, and even, you know, my writing's all sloppy. I'm just trying to get through this. And, you know, my main goal, too, is to get through this book, which I'm probably at least halfway, if not more. And I should be over with it sooner than later. And then I want to, you know, look into the stuff a little deeper to understand it better. And then hopefully I'll do, like, a video on the whiteboard, you know, or multiple videos. And I can actually draw out, like, charts and graphs, and I can explain it a lot easier. So I'm just sharing with you my process as I'm going through this book. But then we go into Matthew chapter 26, verse 28, and Luke chapter 22, verse 20. And he talked about how Christ's blood removes the curse, but it also introduces the blessed condition of the new covenant. And so, just like Adam and Eve received curse and blessing in the Garden of Eden, you know, with the covenant of redemption, I guess. What was that called? Yeah, because Noah's the covenant of preservation, and so Adam and Eve, it's the covenant of redemption. I'm pretty sure that's what he referred to it as. There was the covenant of creation. I'm just looking this up for myself. Yeah, the covenant of redemption. So, just like the covenant of redemption where, you know, there was cursing because man sinned, but then also God promised blessing. And so, when Christ died, he took on himself the curse, and he inaugurated the blessing. And then, in closing, he said that God promised Abraham redemption, and only God passes through the pieces. Abraham has no obligation. So we talked about this cutting of the covenant, and how, I guess, the sacrifice, or whatever, the symbol for, you know, the death, when the covenant was made, they would be cut into pieces. And I guess that, you know, people are supposed to pass through them, however, whatever way. That's stuff I gotta look into more. But I guess that, like, God manifested, basically, and when God made the covenant with Abraham, God passed through the pieces. And so usually, you know, this is, like, I guess when man makes a covenant or something. Like, I think in Jeremiah, when it talked about how the Israelites broke the covenant, and Zedekiah and stuff, like, they passed through the covenant, or they passed through the pieces, and, you know, they broke it. So that was like, it's like an oath. And so when God made this promise to Abraham, God made the oath on himself, and God passed through the pieces, and Abraham had no obligations in this. And so this is the covenant of promise. And so that's that. And then in the next chapter, he talks about the seal of the promise. Okay, instead of going on right to the next covenant, it's going to be the Abrahamic seal of the covenant. So that will be next. Thank you. God bless.